Thank you for joining us today. We've got the Prout Cafe, and today we have Clare Strawn with us. Thank you for being here, Clare.
I'm so excited to be here.
So you've been involved with Prout for a while. Can you just give us an introduction to who you are and how you got involved with Prout?
Yeah, it's really hard to make that a concise response, but
You
I've
don't
been
need concise.
a political and community activist since the mid 70s, and which kind of takes me through journeys through lots of the different variations of political movements and issues. So when I moved to Eugene, which was in 2010, I happened to move across the street from the Prout Institute and got exposed to some of those ideas. And I really was excited to participate in that work because it brought together in one view all the different strings from my past. It brought together a spiritual practice with a kind of a socialist equity vision with multiple viewpoints, incorporated and welcomed, and a local emphasis and a strategy. What's really important to me is that what I do has a clear link and a strategy, a vision from what I'm doing today with my time to where we want to go. And so that connection is what was really important to me.
Can you talk a little bit more about the strategy? Because I think that that's what everyone is looking for, that we all know whatever we're doing today isn't working. When I get up in the morning, I run into 50 different problems throughout my day that shouldn't be this way. But I think that no one really knows how to bridge the gap between this big systems problems that are going on and just what you do in a day-to-day life. How does Prout help with that? Or what does it provide that allows you to kind of problem solve throughout your day?
Right. Well, first of all, Prout is really visionary, and all the literature talks in terms of things should be like this and things should be like that. And that makes me crazy because really the question is, how do we get from here to there? So the first principle, I think, is to work locally. And I've heard it called bloom where you're planted. But that's about empowering ourselves to make effect in the things that affect our lives immediately. And one of the ideas is economic democracy. You can't have political democracy. You can't have a voice in the political system if you don't have economic democracy, And so economic democracy takes a lot of different forms. In the smallest level, it can take the form of worker co-ops, where people who contribute to a business own the business, get the returns of the business, have say about how it goes. And that's been shown to have a greater ecological accountability, greater wealth, and just lessening economic inequality, because of course workers and managers get paid the same. And so that's really empowering. That's what happens here. And then you're looking at, well, then how do homemakers and how do caretakers and how do all these people who are part of the formal economy get folded into that vision? And they get folded into that vision by creating their own cooperatives and working together that way. So then the other piece of that is what we call drainage of capital, which is in a local community like Eugene, for instance. A lot of money leaves. Like if you go to McDonald's, 90 cents out of every dollar probably goes to some corporate this is an estimate. This isn't an accurate number. Goes to a corporate pocketbook, right? But if you go to a local cafe, all of that money stays locally. Tons of money. 80% of our money for groceries goes out of the area. But we're a huge food growing area. So Eugene has a depressed economy. How do we build that wealth and that give us the ability to solve our own problems, to meet our own basic needs, by keeping our money locally and investing in our community businesses, community endeavors, local housing, healthcare, and education. So that's the vision. It goes from building locally, but then you can't just be this isolated little Eugene bubble. That doesn't work either. We have to be part of a global network of other communities. We have to have economic exchange and cultural exchange and exchange of ideas um, with people all around the world. So it's not one or the other, but it's a relationship between the smaller and the larger, which is a whole systems perspective and framework.
So this discussion about localization brings up something that I read in your bio, which you sent, and you mentioned that you worked with the African People's Solidarity Committee, and you
Mhm.
mentioned that that shifted you away from identity politics to understanding more about historical and economic structures of colonialism. Can you tell us more about your experience working with them and how that shifted your perspective and what you learned about localization through them?
Ah, boy, that's a heavy question. So first of all, this was in 1977 to 87, about that decade. And the African People's Socialist Party was an continuation of the Black Power movement. So, but rather than like Black power as Black identity only, they called themselves African internationalists, and they were basing that on an economic analysis of the central role that African people had in building the wealth of the West. And they consider themselves an internal colony in the United States. So that positions the identity of African and Black in an economic relationship to the West and to the United States. It's not just Black power. It's like, hey, this is where Black power comes from. It comes from the fact that everything is built on our backs. So then what their strategy was rather than becoming politically isolated as a Black movement, they wanted to build relationships with white working class community people. Because in their economic analysis, we had a lot to gain by allying with them, and seeing that as a strategy to create basically a socialist system. So that kind of shifted from, and I came to that from the lesbian feminist movement. Okay, so that was a big challenging shift, because you can really clearly see what are the economic relationships, what is the history of opportunism of white movements and white working class in relationship to African people. And they're offering us an alliance, a strategy to repair that and to move forward. And this is so much more on the agenda now. People are way more woke to this now than they were then. So that's very exciting, right? Um, so myself and maybe 50 or so other white activists worked what we call under the leadership of the Black African People's Socialist Party. We had our own democratic centralist organization with our own leadership, of which I was part, and we worked as an ally under the strategy and the analysis of the African People's Socialist Party.
That's so interesting. Do you know, I mean, I'm speaking entirely out of ignorance right now, but are there similar movements going on, organizations going on right now? Because I know that there's been a lot of criticism of white savior complexes where we look at a impoverished area and say like, oh, well, we can just figure out how to fix that, and coming in and not listening to the local people, and the people living there know what they need, but there's like there's a lack of communication between people of different races and people of different economic privileges. Do you know of systems that are already in place to help people work together across those lines?
Really good question. I know at the time when I was doing this work, the international solidarity movement was really big. We were very much involved in solidarity with the Nicaraguan and Salvadoran and Angola and Mozambique, because this is when the national liberation struggles around the world were becoming strong and coming to the forefront. And they were saying to us, come be in solidarity with us. And this is what we need you to do. Primarily help us transfer resources from where they are rich, where we have access to make them available to them. So a lot of those still exist. The African People's Solidarity Committee, and under the rubric of the Uhuru movement, Uhuru means freedom, still exists. Um, so, it's kind of a different landscape then. And I think the landscape now, because between now and then, the US government did a lot of work to try to destroy the Black leadership in the Black community and putting people in prison and killing people off, that a lot of that leadership capacity um, is no longer really strong here now. There's a lot of passionate young people who are tapping into the historical leadership from their community. But when I look out, and of course Eugene has its own demographic weirdness, but I don't see leadership from a leftist perspective saying, we are African leadership and we're inviting you to be in solidarity with us. We see things like the Poor People's Movement and the more religious or side of Black movements, being very open and inviting all inclusive membership, but it's a different kind of paradigm and relationship structure.
So you mentioned that the idea of community control is an idea that's very much rooted in the Black movement, right?
Yeah.
Do you see I'm trying to think of a way to, it seems like there's a very large difference between a lot of like white conservatives that are very much against globalism and against government control, and they are very much in favor of localism. And then on the left, there seems to be this kind of splintering where a lot of um, elite level liberals, or like there's a globalization emphasis among liberals, where it's very much about like getting rid of borders and increasing trade and just like being very much poured into that, as opposed to this idea of community control and localization. And how do you balance the value for globalization and localization?
Um, well, that's where Prout has some really good answers. First of all, neoliberalism is the idea that that natural resources and human resources are there for the benefit of making profit, right? And neoliberalism is the merging of that economic ideal with governance. And so they're trying to reduce the capacity of government to balance out the extraction of capital wherever they go. So that's the agenda, the neoliberal agenda. And Naomi Klein really spells it out really well in the shock doctrine. But I think a lot of in America, people use the word liberal, meaning not conservative. But I think that we need to shift our thinking to understand that that's where that comes from. And also, Heather Cox Richardson has some really good commentary about the genesis of conservatism and the use of the word liberal and all of that. So anyway, in Prout, the idea is, as I said, let's work where we're planted with our community, economic community, our cultural community, respecting our heritage, and then let's build on that from the very local out, to larger and larger regions, so that leadership comes from the level of your local working cooperative, nominates you as a good person, and leadership moves up through the different geographic levels so that you have a principled and accountable leadership at the global level, right? And neoliberalism doesn't work that way. Neoliberalism is like, who's got the power, who wants to keep it, you're elected. So that's one of the advantages I think that Prout has, is it really lays out very meticulous kind of way how that can unfold if we do it right, and based also on what we call neo-humanistic principles of moral right, judgment and human compassion, and all of those important principles that should be the guiding forces for planetary development.
So I want to go back to the language aspect because I think that when we're here trying to like figure out what Prout is and how do you explain it, because it's this, like Prout,
Huge.
it takes
Yeah.
some like, what is that?
Yeah.
Would you say that I know that it has been described as it's categorized as a leftist political philosophy or political system.
Mhm.
Would you say that it is inaccurate to call it either liberal or conservative?
Yes. Yes. Um, because those terms, liberal and conservative, have Americanized and Westernized baggage in context and how we understand them. So I just don't think they're appropriate terms for describing the landscape that we want to work in and move towards.
Okay. Making a mental note for going forward.
Partially,
Can you tell us a little bit about the projects that you're currently working with? I believe you're working with integrated development for homelessness, helping the homelessness situation in Eugene. Is that right?
yeah, that's partially right. I'm going to backtrack a little bit on that because in 2018, I went to this amazing conference in St. Louis, and it was the New Economy Coalition. And there were groups from all across the country who are doing local community cooperative development, okay, along the lines that I was describing. And they were mostly led by women of color and mostly from the South and from the Northeast. And that was so inspiring to me because it just felt like since the last time I touched base with the movement, like 30 years ago, it was really evolved. I mean, people had a more higher understanding use of language. They were like different kinds of inclusivity. It was just really in the vision for what we can do on the ground and where that can take us was really great. So I took back to Eugene a lot of those really exciting stories, and you can find those online under the neweconomy.net. Um, and and gave some examples of that and said, can we do that here? And the reason why I asked that question is because those communities have different historical and economic basis than Eugene does. For instance, in Jacksonville, Mississippi, they have huge parts of the town that have been disinvested and abandoned. Of course, this is mostly where Black people live, right? And so they have abilities to do things like take over property and remake them and own them by the community for community land co-ops, right? They have a history of Black social engagement and social organization and activism that they're building on. Okay, here in Eugene, we're a little more comfortable. We're mostly very kind of suburban, single family homes. No, very few Black people because because we kicked them out, and excluded Black people in the development of Eugene. So we have a legacy about our diversity here, and that limits what our capacity is for transformation today. Okay, so my question was, this is what's happening elsewhere in the country and also in the world. Can we make it happen here? And my concern is we don't have the urgency. We don't have the economic urgency. Um, and we don't have the kind of radical leadership that comes from other places. We have a limited ability to collaborate and work together. Everybody works in their personal issue siloed, like we have homelessness and we have healthcare and we have ecology and we have this, and everybody's in their little camp, but we don't really do an intersectional kind of working together. And so the answer to my question, the people who came to the program, were that what Eugene is lacking is a sense of community, security and community. And it's a different kind of need than maybe what's happening in the South. And I think that having a lot of homeless people in the streets is a message to those of us who feel any kind of personal security that, hey, folks, that's temporary. You can go down just as easily as anybody else, so you better toe the line. Okay, so so that's a very important, one of the proudest things is that you have to understand your local context before you can figure out how to move with it. I forgot what the question was.
I was asking about the work that you're doing with the homeless
Oh,
population.
okay, thanks. So with that program, I started this group called Cooperation Eugene, and a lot of the new economy network is called Cooperation this and Cooperation that. So we're Cooperation Eugene, and we had some different ideas and different projects that we were trying out, and there was a general education effort to get these ideas across, and then COVID came, and we needed to take a break. So now we're just starting to refocus and reorganize. And the project that we started to do, and we're doing it in partnership with the Prout Institute, which is our parent 501c3, um, is having that we realize the biggest issue in Eugene is homelessness and climate. So that we felt like that we had some perspective to offer the current efforts around both of those things. And so we decided to draft a design challenge to put out to the community. And the design challenge is to create an integrated development vision for how to address housing, affordable housing, and climate change together as a systemic shift. Okay, so that's kind of broader than just housing the homeless. It's affordable housing for all, okay, which includes the fact that the majority of people who live in Eugene are housing burdened, meaning that more than 30% of their income goes towards housing. So we kind of have a broader vision of that, and we see it as a systemic shift issue rather than an issue of trying to address people's burning immediate needs. There's a lot of people who are heart passionately motivated to help people figure out a more efficient tent. You know, or to not be swept and moved around every night with these police sweeps, or to get health care on the street, or, you know, street survival issues is something that motivates a lot of people to activism, and that's totally needed. In the framework that I'm operating from, I call that hospice work, and that we have a dying system, so people are dying, so we have to attend to them. And there's also a role for systems change work, which is to take a few thousand feet higher and look from a systemic analysis about what's underlying causes and what are the steps that we can take to shift the basis of those underlying causes of those problems.
So you mentioned the design challenge, which are like those words together. I'm like so excited. How did you put out the design challenge? Who did it go to? Who saw it? And have you like what stage is this in? Was it just released? Have you gotten responses? How's it been going?
Well, we've been going for about, I don't know, 6 months or so. The Prout and Cooperation Eugene wrote a concept paper, which is about 4 pages, and some design criteria of what we would envision a housing for all system to look like. And we didn't broadly disseminate it. We kind of looked at the landscape in Eugene and the different people who have interest in this issue and expertise and have a history of wanting to work across boundaries. And we made invitations to them. And so right now we have a core organizing team, which is mostly Prout and Cooperation Eugene, and a new person who was brought in through that process. And we decided we're doing a series of webinars to kind of do deep dives into the different components of housing, which are, what are they? They're land use, policy, financing, do people have decent paying jobs, the climate, ecology, environmental issues. So those are maybe 5 of the components. There's probably more that I'm not thinking of right now. And so we have little teams who are doing deep dives into those components, identifying who's doing work in them, what are the subject matter experts in that we can tap, and then doing more broader community education on each of those components so that people can start to really dig into the bigger picture. And then as we do that, we want to weave together how those components are linked together. So because, you know, because that's what integrated means, that it's one system, they fit together, and then they create something new. So we've never done this before. I don't know anybody else who's ever done this before. So we're kind of allowing ourselves to have an emergent design. An emergent design is you start where you're at, you do something, you evaluate, then you take the next step. So we have about, I don't know, 20, 40 people who come to the webinars, and we're starting to reach out broader now. The first one was uh, introduction to integrated development that Ravi did, and we have a slideshow available on that. The second one we just did was a critique of of the Lane County housing solutions from the county commissioners in a local nonprofit group from an integrated development perspective. And so the next one is going to be introducing our partnership with Green Island in Denmark about how does climate infrastructure, affordable non-fossil fuel infrastructure fold into this question. And we're also looking at things, the financing of it is really big. I mean, that's probably the key piece. So, and that has a whole range of things from a state bank to crowdsourcing, to community development corporations, and how can people who have some resources, which there are a fair number of those folks here in Eugene, how can they pool their assets so that we can invest in community land trusts and things like that.
So if someone were listening to this and we're really excited to like do something similar, or maybe there's a project in their own community that they really want to tackle or figure out how to bring the issue of integrative solutions up, what you're living right across from the Prout Institute. So you have kind of your own network set up. For people who are just starting out, what would you say if you could give any advice for people that want to be coming up with solutions and working on this? How do they get involved, or how do they start something in their own communities?
Well, the first step in community development from the Prout perspective is to know your community. So there's a community organizing method called asset mapping, which is you kind of take a survey of what are the things that we have to work with. Do we have people who know how to do Zoom meetings? Do we have churches or public spaces where we can have face-to-face meetings? Do we have a university that has a lot of knowledgeable people and research? Do we have any simpatico city councilors? Do we have a crew of young people with energy who want to invest, and learn as they go? Do we have a crew of older people who aren't working anymore, who can be a little bit more humble and learn from the young people? Just the whole there's a whole research on asset mapping, and I think that's the place to start. And that's where you start talking to people, and you find out, well, what are the critical issues? What is the underlying problem? To really dig underneath the surface. Well, is it people living on the streets, or is it the fact that people can't get a decent paying job, or is it the fact that speculators are buying all the property and all the money is going to Seattle and San Francisco? So that kind of analysis and thinking is a good first start.
Thank you so much. It's inspiring. I don't know. I love design challenges and the idea of bringing these big ideas and like having a roadmap for like a strategy for tackling it is very exciting to me.
One of the things I hope we can do is kind of map our strategy as we go. Because when you're doing an emergent strategy, it's like, okay, what do we do next? And another reference, if you're not already familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown, she has a book called Emergent Strategy, which is really, really powerful. She's a professional community organizer, really visionary, and she takes her lessons from Octavia Butler, who was a science speculative fiction writer. And so really inspiring. It really inspired the Cooperation Eugene when we first launched.
That's so cool. Does anyone else have any questions for Claire?
I had a question. I'm really curious. both about how this is informed by both your history working with like African American communities in the US and also housing issues in Eugene, since from my perspective, what I've observed, a lot of there are a lot of issues with policing in both those contexts. I was interested in if that's part of what you're working on, is addressing the over policing of homelessness, and there's anything we can do to kind of push back on that, or any ideal strategies that we could implement in the future to move away from that, and why that would be beneficial, or if you disagree, why and what you think about that.
It's a good observation, Asha. Thank you. As I said, that this particular design challenge is not really focused on the immediate needs on the street. However, as individuals, all of us are out there working, excuse me, working in support of the communities that are doing that work. Clearly, the role of the police is to protect the property, and at the expense of the people. And I mean, those are kind of broad, absolutist statements, but to a large degree, that's what we're experiencing. In East Oakland, when I was doing that work, we did a tent city. This was way before. This was in 1977. We did a tent city in a park that was mostly where homeless Black people were living. And we were called as the white solidarity workers to come and buffer between the residents and the police department. Now, this is Oakland, California. If you'll remember back during Occupy, they were the first police department to brutally evict occupiers. They came with a SWAT team the first night and whacked us all, So there, everywhere African Americans are on the front line of policing, and look at the history of that. Look where that comes from. So I don't really see it as separate issues, and I think that we have to show up for where our heart is. But for long-term strategic work, that's not where I'm investing my energy, and I'm really grateful to those who are investing their energy there.
I had a question in a different line. Can you speak more to what you find appealing about, or what you see as the role of spirituality in activism? That's something that you mentioned as something that you appreciate about Prout, as like kind of bringing spirituality into activism.
Yeah. So when I was involved in the left, spirituality was not part of the picture, and it's very challenging work. If you can imagine, being a white person in East Oakland, learning how to experience the world from Black working class viewpoint and how to take leadership for Black people, really challenging, right? And we have our own trips. And so I emerged from that being psychologically devastated. And I think there's a lot of people who have been politically active over the years who get really burnt out. And so having a spiritual practice and a spiritual community gives you the inner core, the inner strength, the interconnectedness with the universe, to carry your center through the conflicts. If you don't have that inner strength and that inner energetic connection, then you get pulled here and pulled there, and after a while you don't know what you think. So having both this individual spiritual practice and a community is what is the most important counter to that. It's your guideline.
I'm curious about following up on this. Like, if you feel like there needs to be a set like belief system to go with that, or if just like believing in community and having that space and like belief of just like an inherent force, even if it's not very specific, is enough, or if it needs to be like attached to some kind of system or like practice, like if you need to be like actually meditating, or if it's enough to just like believe in the universe and gather with people who also share that belief.
I don't think that there's a particular path that is the way. Everybody finds their own path. Um, I do think that it's really important to have what's called sangha, which is the community around you that helps you see yourself clearly and helps you stay on the path. That you know, all of us go through a certain period of life where we're seeking and we're exploring different paths, and that's part of the process. So you know, there's very powerful Christian communities, particularly in the Black community, that carry this core, you know. Um, so it's not a particular path that's important. What's important is that you do have one, or you have people around you that support that.
I have a somewhat related question, just as far as to what extent spirituality is built into the framework of Prout. And I think that there's a lot of people that find strength in spirituality and religion. And I think on the other side, we also have a large number of people in this country living with religious trauma that have kind of become extremely suspicious of the role that religion plays in government, and really focusing on the separation of church and state and finding that very important. And there might be a lot of suspicion towards a system that brings in religious or spiritual elements into a political system. Can you kind of speak to what the role is for an individual versus a community versus a political system, and how is it important to keep it separate, or how much is it actually built into the entire government structure?
Well, Prout is premised on a spiritual philosophy called neo-humanism, right? Which argues for human beings to evolve and to express our highest ability in community, in the government, in the economy, in everything, in relationship to each other. So in that respect, it's entirely integrated with the Prout vision. The founder of Prout, PR Sarkar, is also a great spiritual teacher. And so sometimes but he used different names for those different roles throughout his life. So some people might say, oh, that's a guru thing. I don't want to have anything to do with guru. You know, that's their trip. But, but the principles that are there are universal truths, you know, if you believe in universal truths. And we've been gifted with both of those things in that package. I think the way that I've seen Prout operate in the world, it's like not insisting on believing any kind of particular belief system. It's part of neo-humanism, in fact, is to use your intellect and ability to discern, to think through what you're doing with your life. And that's kind of the difference between a spiritual platform and a religious institution.
I have a follow-up question, but it might get too into the weeds of like the political system. All right. I think we have got like 10 minutes, so I'll just ask it. And I don't know how much you can speak to this, but I'm wondering, given us, there are specific things that people like to fight about a lot right now. So, for example, abortion, gay rights, things like that. And there are a lot of people with religious foundations for, you know, like the way that society should run is based on religious principles. And to my understanding, Prout is trying to give as much freedom to people as possible to like live out their lives in accordance with their culture, in accordance with their beliefs, but at the same time protecting overreach where you're not being trampled by other people. How do you this is kind of just a branch off on the discussion of religion and spirituality, but how would a system like Prout allow people to live their lives in accordance with their religion while not dominating, I suppose? Like, how does that fit into the political organization?
There's this document called the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And that is a secular, United Nations document that basically is based on what we call cardinal human values. So, the right for women to have sovereignty over our own bodies, for example. The right for cultures to exist and speak their own language. So there's a set of those that is more and more universally being adopted. And I think Prout stands up for that based on an agreement about what those values are. And it doesn't try to impose values on anybody. But if there's a cultural system, say female genital mutilation, that has a practice that violates, that value, then there's a statement about that. But the people who live in that culture and who are implementing the system in their area, it's their responsibility to interpret and to make it happen.
Do you have any other last words for people that might be listening or interested in getting involved in this kind of thing?
Yeah, we're just getting started. There's so much, that has potential to roll out, and I so appreciate you guys taking the creativity and the initiative to do this project. So it's very inspiring to me. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and talking with us. This was
My
so
pleasure.
great.
Yeah. All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Have a good day.
Bye.